So, for today's movie review, I'll be reviewing Aquaman, the overall 6th installment in the DC Extended Universe, or whatever the hell it's called. This also marks the overall 3rd appearance of the Aquaman character to appear within the DC Cinematic Universe, but the first movie to be solely focused on Aquaman himself. In regards to the overall production history of this movie, from what I could gather, the idea of Warner Brothers trying to make a live-action movie based on Aquaman has been floating around since 2004, and the Aquaman movie itself has gone through various stages in development hell where it's changed both script writers, directors, producers, so on and so forth. But sometime around the early 2010s is where production of the movie gets really interesting, and I do mean interesting because there was this rumor going around that James Cameron was going to be directing Aquaman. And as soon as this information was announced, everyone was on board with the idea because they wanted to see how James Cameron would direct an Aquaman movie. But as it turned out, the notion of James Cameron directing an Aquaman movie originated as a ongoing joke from this TV show called Entourage, where apparently within that universe, James Cameron directed an Aquaman movie, which sounds really fascinating to me because I would love to see what would happen if James Cameron directed an Aquaman movie. But at the same time, I do find it hilarious that a ton of people fell for this joke thinking James Cameron would direct an Aquaman movie. But anywho, sometime after that, Marvel would release Avengers, which became a monster hit, paving the way for not only future superhero movies, but also creating the idea that cinematic universes can be a thing. So naturally, Warner Brothers and DC decided to jump on that cinematic universe bandwagon by making that cinematic universe revolved around the superheroes from the DC comics. And as the DC Cinematic Universe was underway, new life was given to the overall production for the Aquaman movie once James Wan was cast as the director for this movie. James Wan being the same guy who directed movies from Saw, Insidious, The Conjuring 2, along with Furious 7. Now sure, I'm not the biggest fan of James Wan's filmography, but I was willing to give him a chance. And like any other installment of the DC Extended Universe, this movie got a ton of positive reception from the test screenings. And I had to be skeptical about this because looking at the way some of the past installments of the DC Extended Universe have progressed, you have a movie that doesn't look very good, gets a ton of praise from the test screening, but then the movie comes out and turns out to not be a very good movie. With the exception of the 2017 Wonder Woman movie, because I actually thought that movie was pretty good, just not as amazing as everyone else made out to be. I also wasn't really the biggest fan of the advertising for this movie because the trailers made this movie look okay at best. However, like I said earlier, I am more than willing to give this movie a chance because ever since I saw Wonder Woman, I do believe that the DC Extended Universe is slightly getting better with each new installment. Also, on top of that, I really dug the idea of Aquaman getting his own movie because I like Aquaman. I don't view him as a punchline like everyone else does. I always took him seriously, even more so than Captain America growing up. But more importantly, is Aquaman a good movie? As for the plot of the movie, set sometime after the events of Justice League, Arthur Curry, aka Aquaman, soon discovers that his younger half-brother, King Orm, wants to unite all the undersea kingdoms in order to destroy the surface world for polluting Earth's oceans. But in order for Arthur to claim his rightful place as King of Atlantis, he, along with Princess Mera, set out on a globe-trotting adventure in order to find a powerful artifact known as the Trident of Atlant in order to reclaim his rightful place as King of Atlantis. Can Arthur Curry, along with Princess Mera, find the Trident of Atlant in time? Or will Arthur's younger half-brother, King Orm, succeed in becoming the Ocean Master and unite all the undersea kingdoms in order to destroy the surface world? In terms of what I liked about the movie, the first aspect of Aquaman that I'm going to talk about is actually kind of hilarious since a lot of movie critics had problems with this aspect of the movie, that being one of tone, since a lot of movie critics complained that the tone was all over the place. I, on the other hand, thought the movie had a very consistent tone from start to finish. If I had to compare the tone of Aquaman to any other superhero movie out there, I would put this in the same ballpark as something like Guardians of the Galaxy or Thor Ragnarok, in that sense where the movie has a lighthearted tone due to the movie's ridiculous premise, and predominantly knows that it's ridiculous and decides to have fun, but does remember to have some serious moments sprinkled throughout the movie, but not too serious to not be any fun. Another aspect to this movie that I liked has to do with the fact that Aquaman goes all out with the character's mythos from the comics. Like, in some cases, I actually think Aquaman is a much better movie about Thor than any of the Thor movies from the MCU. Because when the first Thor movie came out back in 2011, I had high expectations for that movie, because here's a movie that's about a Norse god, and you could do anything with that. Like, you could have the character and his friends visit the 9 realms, encounter different cultures of people, fight monsters. Instead, we get a fish out of water story on Earth. With Aquaman, on the other hand, we get exactly that, where we have Aquaman and company exploring the 7 seas, encountering different cultures of mer people or merfolk, and they do occasionally encounter some monsters. Also, the scale to this movie is surprisingly bigger than expected. Now, granted, if you were to compare the scale to this movie to something like, again, Guardians of the Galaxy or Thor Ragnarok, it's nothing new. But as far as a movie within the DC Extended Universe is concerned, this movie is much bigger and more epic in scope than the entirety of Justice League. And keep in mind, this is a movie about Aquaman, which is shocking because I wasn't expecting a movie about Aquaman to have this story that's this big, grand, epic of all things. I also really love the costume design for this movie, at least with all the main characters, because if you had to look at all of these characters in relation to their comic counterparts, their costume design looks like it was ripped straight from the comics. From Princess Mera, who has a more comic-accurate costume in this movie as opposed to her costume in Justice League, to King Orm's Ocean Master getup he wears at the end of the movie. Even Aquaman's longtime arch-nemesis Black Manta looks exactly like his comic counterpart, which was my biggest concern going into the movie, since I was afraid the filmmakers weren't gonna give Black Manta his big helmet and maybe modernize his design by giving Black Manta a much smaller helmet. But the filmmakers went out of their way to actually give Black Manta his big helmet design, which translated to the big screen a lot better than I thought it was going to be. So I'm happy on that front. And as far as Aquaman's costume is concerned, although he doesn't really wear a costume till near the end of the movie, sure, it isn't the traditional orange and green costume that he's known to wear in the comics, but I think the gold is a nice way to update the costume in some shape or form. Another aspect to the movie that I liked is how this movie subverts tropes within the fantasy genre. Because Aquaman, on top of being a superhero movie, it's also a fantasy film. And within your usual fantasy movies or stories, you typically have the following trope. The main character is either an orphan or has a single parent. They're somehow the chosen one that gets trained by some wise mentor, and either the main character leaves their training prematurely or the mentor character dies. And while the main character is on their journey, they are often accompanied by a band of ragtag warriors of some sort, and so on and so forth. With Aquaman, on the other hand, when it comes to the handling of these tropes, when the movie first starts, at first glance, it looks like we're going to do the trope of main character was raised by a single parent because the other one died. And as the movie progresses, it turns out that the other parent is alive and well. So there's one trope subverted. As for the old wise mentor trope, throughout the movie, we have flashbacks of Vulko training Arthur. And it's established that Arthur has completed most of the tasks given to him by Vulko. And there is a point in time where Vulko gets arrested by King Orm. And the first time I saw this, I thought King Orm was gonna kill Vulko right then and there. But no, King Orm simply just has his bodyguards arrest Vulko, and that's it. And when the movie ends, Vulko is still alive. As for the main character being accompanied by a band of warriors trope, Aquaman is being accompanied by Princess Mera. And I'll talk more about the handling of this particular trope in a few minutes, but I think you get the point I'm making in terms of how this movie subverts certain tropes seen within the fantasy genre. Another aspect to this movie that I liked is very similar to that of Spider-Man Homecoming, where here's a superhero movie that has multiple villains, but the way the movie utilizes each villain doesn't make the movie feel overcrowded. Granted, within the Aquaman comics, outside of his arch nemesis Black Manta, Aquaman never really had the best rogues gallery until the 52 reboot from several years ago, where Ocean Master became a more prominent member of his rogues gallery, along with the introduction of a new group of villains called the Trench. And with that out of the way, let's actually talk about each and every single villain that appears within the movie in the roles they play. Starting with King Orem, aka Ocean Master, who is the younger stepbrother to Aquaman, who is our main villain of the movie, followed by Black Manta, a high-tech pirate, who is our secondary villain, and these two have an alliance because of their mutual hatred of Aquaman. And this works to the movie's advantage, since you have Ocean Master, who's our main villain, whereas Black Manta, despite him being Aquaman's main arch nemesis from the comics, is only playing second fiddle, and is more than willing to do so, for the simple reason that Black Manta isn't trying to be the main villain of this movie, since we already have Ocean Master. And in some ways, this movie beautifully sets up Black Manta to be the villain of the next Aquaman movie beautifully. As for the third and final villain of the movie, the Gilman of the Trench, they are utilized very well within the context of the movie, both within the story and its thematics, which I'll talk about later. But as far as the Trench is concerned, they're only utilized as a antagonistic obstacle for Aquaman and Princess Mera when they do visit the Trench to get to the Hidden Sea in order to retrieve Atlantis' trident. And they serve that purpose very well, since the Trench aren't trying to be major antagonists in the same vein as someone like Ocean Master or Black Manta. They are just merely an obstacle for Aquaman and are utilized as such. Because if the Trench did try to become major villains in the same vein as someone like Ocean Master or Black Manta, then I think the movie would have been overcrowded. But the Trench, in the grand scheme of things, are merely small fries to such villains, and I think they play that part very well. Now, as for the thematical aspect of the Trench, before I even get to that point, we have to go back a couple years ago when we had advertising for either Batman v Superman or Justice League. A poster of Aquaman was released that said, "Unite the Seven." And a lot of people thought this was referring to the fact that Justice League was going to feature 7 superheroes. And when Justice League came out, it was only the 6 heroes that consisted of Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, Flash, Cyborg, and Aquaman. Now, fast forward to this movie, it is established that Atlantis used to be this great civilization that destroyed itself, and through its destruction gave birth to 7 separate underwater kingdoms. So maybe that's what the poster was referring to? Not the 7 heroes of Justice League, but the 7 underwater kingdoms of Aquaman. Although, as it turned out, of those 7 kingdoms, only 5 remain. And among the 5 remaining undersea kingdoms, each one represents a different aspect of humanity, where you got one kingdom which represents upper class society, one that represents middle class society, one that represents lower class, but then you got 2 of the other kingdoms that are meant to diametrically oppose one another. The 2 in question are the kingdom of the fishermen, which represents the best of mankind, opposing the kingdom of the Trench, which represents the worst of mankind. Now, why do I bring this up? Let's really take a look at the action sequence revolving around Aquaman, Princess Mera swimming through the Trench in order to get to the Hidden Sea. Action sequence itself takes place at night, and that's when we first see the Gilman of the Trench. And when Arthur and Mera first confront these Gilmen, Arthur starts using flares and discovers that these Gilmen are afraid of the light, and uses his knowledge to his disadvantage to deter the Gilman as they swim through the trench. Now, going back to how the trench represents the ugly side of humanity, there are parts of us who are completely comfortable living in the dark and being afraid of the light being the truth, or at least something which is equivalent to what we know as the truth, while on the other hand, not willing to come out of our comfortable trench, safety concerned in the shadows of our own self-imposed exile, because we can't bear the possibility of anyone to shed light on position or views. And while on the subject of thematics, the next aspect of the movie I want to talk about is the movie's overall thematic, overall unity. Now, what do I mean by this? Think back to that poster I was talking about several moments ago that had Aquaman with the phrase, "Unite the Seven." I think that phrase isn't just referring to the 7 undersea kingdoms, but also might refer to the 7 continents as well, since Arthur is the son of both land and sea. And in order for world unity to be achieved, people have to set aside their differences, no matter nationality, creed, gender, all that stuff, and simply listen to each other in order to come up with modern solutions to our current problems. A good example of this idea is present sometime before the final battle, in which we see Aquaman confronting the Karathan while trying to obtain the Trident, where he decides to use his powers to communicate with sea life in order to communicate with the sea monster, in which the sea monster replies, "You can understand me," thus allowing the two to communicate to each other in order to come up with a solution to Arthur's problem in relation to him dealing with his younger brother, King Orm. Which is why I think Aquaman is such a great superhero in that regard. After all, if other superheroes like Captain America and Wonder Woman can embody the ideas of patriotism and feminism, then I definitely see Aquaman being the physical embodiment of world unity. Another aspect to the movie I like revolves around the action scenes for 2 reasons. One, they're very easy to follow in terms of how they start, progress, and end, even with some of the gimmicky cinematography of having those one-pan action sequences. You could still tell what's going on. And second, all the action scenes are just really fun to watch. My favorite action sequence in the entire movie is the battle in Sicily, where we have Aquaman and Princess Mera battling Black Manta and King Orm's commandos, for the simple reason that the actual fight scene itself felt very old school in a Sam Raimi Spider-Man kind of way, if that makes any sense. Another aspect to the movie I like has to do with the standalone nature of this movie, for the simple reason that you really don't need to watch any of the other installments of the DC Extended Universe to understand this movie. Now sure, it does make reference to Justice League, but you really don't need to watch Justice League to understand this movie. Also, the way in which the filmmakers brought the city of Atlantis to life is very well done. If anything, it's very similar to that of Wakanda from the Black Panther movie, where it feels like a fully realized place that I would love to visit. And we haven't seen a depiction of the city of Atlantis that was this epic since the 2001 Disney animated movie. Now, as for the next aspect of the movie, I have mixed feelings towards the character of Princess Mera, because earlier in this movie review, I talked about how this movie subverted certain tropes that you typically see in a lot of fantasy adventures, and the trope that I talked about earlier revolved around the support cast in your typical fantasy, in which you have your main character surrounded by a ragtag group of warriors that fulfill some kind of position within the group, where you have one character that's the brains of the operation, one character that's the bronze, the wizard, the comical relief, the anti-comical relief, so on and so forth. With this movie, on the other hand, Princess Mera embodies all of these character tropes and positions into one character, where she is the brains of the operation, the magic user, and so on and so forth. And I find Princess Mera's depiction in this movie to be better than the way she was depicted in Justice League, because in Justice League, the only thing I got out of her character was that she was able to control water and she knew Aquaman's mom. That's about about it. As for her depiction in this movie is concerned, as mentioned before, between her and Aquaman, she's the brains of the operation. And when she first meets Aquaman in this movie, she doesn't trust him. She appears to be stubborn and a tad bit standoff-ish to some degree, and she does appear to have a prejudice against mankind, like King Orm. But as the movie progresses, she does start to trust Aquaman a lot more, to a point where she does care for him as both a warrior and a romantic interest, which I'll talk about later. But in short, she has more characterization in this movie than she did in Justice League. The only downside I have with the character revolves around the actress that plays her, Amber Heard. Because to me, I feel like she was the weakest link as far as the acting is concerned, because I feel that all the other actors that appear in this movie played their roles just good enough. With her, on the other hand, it almost felt like she didn't really want to be there, but maybe I'm reading too much into it. Now, in terms of what I dislike about the movie, the first few problems I have with Aquaman are merely nitpicks. The first of three being the opening narration, because I do understand why it's there. I think in the grand scheme of things, it feels redundant for the simple reason that this information is presented to us multiple times throughout the movie, and I feel it takes away from the opening sequence altogether, where I think it would have been better if that opening sequence, when we first see Atlanta meet Arthur's father for the first time, would have been better without the narration. Another nitpick I have with the movie revolves around the foot soldiers of Atlantis, because early on it's established that Atlanteans who are of loyalty have the ability to walk in and out of water without the usage of a special suit. As for any other Atlantean, they have to wear these specialized suits to survive out of the water, or else they die. Now, when we do see some of these foot soldiers on land wearing this armor, it makes a lot of sense. But for a good chunk of the movie, when they're not on land, we see them underwater wearing the same type of suits. I'm just kind of confused as to why they feel the need to wear these suits when they're in their own element. It just felt redundant, that's all. And as for my third and final nitpick, it has to do with the combination of tone, music, and the dialogue that occur around the point in time in which we see Arthur and Mera crash land in the Sahara Desert, since a mixture of those elements during that sequence play the scene off as if it were a romantic comedy, even though the movie's more of a fantasy adventure. Granted, it's only for those few seconds, but it does stick out like a sore thumb when that scene does occur. As for the actual problems I have with the movie, honestly, I don't have too many problems, although the problems that I do have with the movie do stick out. The first major problem being one that I will admit I'm not the first one to bring this up, but I did find this problem to be really comical. That being the way the action scenes begin within the first 2/3 of the movie, in that sense where anytime an action scene does occur, it begins with an explosion. And this happened multiple times throughout the movie to a point where it just became super comical. Thankfully, during the last third of the movie, we don't have that problem, but for the other 2/3, it's just ridiculous. As for the next few problems with the movie, there are two plot holes that I did notice. The first one being one that, again, I am well aware that I'm not the first one to bring this up, but it has to do with the bracelet that King Orm gives Princess Mera during the middle of the movie, since it turns out that the bracelet itself is a tracking device, and sometime after Arthur and Mera escape Atlantis from King Orm and his forces and escape through the humpback whales, I am kind of confused as to why no Atlantean alerted King Orm that Mera and Arthur were still alive inside the whales that weren't that far away from them. Granted, one could make the argument that King Orm was extremely upset due to the fact that Princess Mera just betrayed him, and the two of them were meant to be engaged as king and queen, so maybe his emotions got the better of him, but one would think that some Atlantean foot soldier would maybe activate the tracking device and alert King Orm that Princess Mera is still alive and isn't that far away from him. Also, sometime later, off screen, it turns out King Orm did indeed activate the tracking device when it was already too late, and I feel like there was a scene missing here. Or at least there should have been a scene where maybe we had King Orm talking to Vulko and King Darius, or whatever Dolphrongren's character was called. And maybe he should have been like, man, I even gave your daughter that bracelet. Wait, that bracelet was also a tracking device. Then turns to one of his foot soldiers and says something along the lines of, activate that tracking device and double check to see if Mera is indeed dead, thus having it revealed to King Orm and company that Princess Mera and Arthur are still alive. Another plot hole that I noticed with the movie revolves around King Orm's head commando, who we're never given a name to, but for the first 2/3 of the movie, although he's not a major support character, he does appear enough during the first 2/3 to leave a major impact. But during Aquaman's fight with Black Manta in Italy, there's a point in time where he's fighting Mera, and Mera damages the specialized land armor most of the commandos use, and we see that he's about to die, but then spots a nearby toilet and shoves his head into the toilet to survive. And that's the last we ever see of the character, because he's never mentioned or seen again throughout the remainder of the movie. Another problem that I have with the movie actually has nothing to do with the movie itself. It more revolves around people's criticism of King Orm within the context of the movie. Because when I watched YouTube videos or read reviews in regards to King Orm himself, a lot of people described him as being very simple and is nothing more than a power-hungry tyrant. And while I definitely do understand the whole power-hungry aspect of the character, he's not simple. If anything, he's actually very complex. He's got layers to him. For example, his main motivation behind becoming Ocean Master stems out of one of two factors. The first factor being that he blames mankind for polluting Earth's oceans for the past several decades. The second factor, and main factor, revolves around the birth of Aquaman, since it turned out that when Queen Atlanta gave birth to Aquaman, this led to her execution, and King Orm loved his mother very much, and blames mankind for not only polluting Earth's oceans, but he also blames mankind for the death of his mother, making the central conflict between Aquaman and Ocean Master more dramatic because both brothers blame each other for the death of their mother. Another problem that I have with the movie has to do with Princess Mera's costume, because for a good chunk of the movie, it's predominantly green, like it is in the comics. Yet there are several points in time where the costume itself is like a bluish color, which kind of bugs me considering the fact that the costume's supposed to be green and not blue. Granted, this only happens a few times throughout the movie, but I still find it to be a problem due to the fact that the filmmakers weren't really consistent when it came to Mera's costume color. And as for the last problem that I have with the movie, again, like I said before, although I'm not the first person to bring this problem up, the romantic chemistry between Aquaman and Princess Mera is not very good, for the simple reason that their chemistry was non-existent and unnecessary. Personally, I feel like the filmmakers should have had it be that Aquaman and Princess Mera formed a strong friendship in this movie, which would eventually lead into a more romantic relationship in Aquaman 2, but as the romantic chemistry between Aquaman and Mera sits, it's both non-existent, and when they do take it seriously, it's just ridiculous. So, for my final verdict of Aquaman, if I had to describe this movie in a nutshell, take some of the plot elements from both Thor Ragnarok and Black Panther, mix them together and set it underwater, and you get this movie. Because this movie is a lot better than I originally thought it was going to be, since the trailers made the movie look okay at best. It also doesn't help that this movie is a part of the DC Extended Universe, a franchise that's been very popular to hate on. And this much I will say about Aquaman. For a movie focused on a superhero that a lot of people never really took seriously in the first place, Aquaman is a movie that's more ambitious and epic in scope than some of the previous installments of the DC Extended Universe. And out of all the movies set within the DC Extended Universe, Aquaman, in my opinion, is by far the best of the bunch. For a few reasons. The first reason being that this movie is very similar to the 2017 Wonder Woman movie, where it's a standalone installment that's a part of an ongoing cinematic universe, but you really don't need to watch all the other installments to understand this movie, because this movie works so well by itself. Reason number two, the combination of both tone and visuals are very reminiscent to that of a Marvel movie where it's colorful and campy. But the way this movie proceeds with the campy tone and the color visuals are very different from that of a Marvel movie. And as far as I'm concerned, the DC Extended Universe should have been like this movie in regards to both the color visuals and tone. And for my third and final reason as to why I think this movie is the best installment of the DC Extended Universe simply has to do with the fact that this movie embraces the more outlandish concepts associated with its character. So overall, Aquaman is basically the DC Extended Universe's equivalent to that of Thor, but more fully realized. And before I give my final rating, what did everyone else have to say about Aquaman? So it looks like the movie got generally positive reception. And for my final rating of Aquaman, I give it a 4 out of 5. So, growing up, did you ever take the idea of Aquaman seriously, or did you view him as a joke? And see you later.